We are in lesson number 11 in our study of the book of 1 Samuel. And we are in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, and we were down to beginning with verse number 8. Chapter 8, verse number 8. And so that's where we want to begin. But before moving into the scripture, let us just pause for a moment and discuss the timeline again that was mentioned in lesson 10 concerning the period that the ark was in storage for 20 years. Now, in doing so, the reason why I want to do this is we will be able to see how Samuel, our writer, historically broke his history stories into little segments and focused on the story that he is telling without adding any of the surrounding details. Then, after he's told the story and focused on one thing, for instance, the capture of the ark and the return and the storage of the ark, he will then come back around and he will tell a new story that overlapped that previous story that he had just told, or even maybe going back even further. We've already mentioned that this was the same case with the story of Ruth, the story of Ruth was sitting in the time of Joshua and Judges. Now, you'll stick with me because we're going to speak about the story of Ruth again when Samuel gets on down into the story in 1 Samuel and tells us about the selection of David to be the king later on in this book, at the end of the book. And so we're gonna pick up with what we know about Ruth and where Samuel's fitting her in the story because of how Ruth is related to David, who is going to become the king when Saul dies in the last chapter of this book. But for the time of the ark being in storage, this chart that I have on the board and that's in the notes, it really helps us with the timing of the events. So I want us to look at the board. I brought the board back out for this lesson. All right, now the things that we want to talk about is this. First of all, we know from previous stories that Samuel has already told us that Eli had died, and he died when he was 98 years old after serving as the high priest for 40 years. And we also know that he died on the day that the ark was captured. Boom, right there. Then Samuel has already told us that the Philistines captured that ark and they kept it for 7 months, had lots of trouble with it, and they decided to return the ark. Samuel told us about that. Then he told us that when the ark was returned, it was stored for 20 years at a village called Kiriath-Jearim, and the man who was there consecrated or set aside his son to be the caretaker of that ark, and that ark remained there for 20 years. All right, those are the facts of the stories we had up through chapter 7. Then coming into chapter 8, let me back up a minute. Also, what had happened was, after the ark has come in and he's already told us it's going to be stored there for 20 years, he then tells us how when the ark was brought back, that they went over to this place where Samuel's going to place this rock called he's going to call it the Ebenezer Stone, but it's not set yet, and the Israelites are going to defeat the Philistines back right where the ark was captured. They're going to defeat the Philistines right in here in this 20-year time, kick the Philistines out, and they no longer have control of the ark as long as Samuel is the judge. All right, then we come down into the story, chapter 8, going into chapter 8, where the people know that Samuel's two sons, not Phinehas, but Samuel's two sons were evil. And they were ministering down in Beersheba as priests. And they did not want, if something happened to Samuel, for either of his sons to take over. So they came and they asked for a king. So we know that. Okay. So now here in chapter 8, the men have come, the leaders have come, and they've asked Samuel for a king. Okay, so far so good. Now we can look ahead because of this next story. Samuel is focused totally on Saul becoming king of Israel. He's not telling us about the ark being captured, the ark being stored. He's telling us about Saul being king. So he has segregated the stories, and he's now tracing back through the timeline like we've talked about before and how Samuel is written. He's tracing back through the timeline and telling us this story about King Saul. So let's look at the board again. Okay. It's interesting because we have to put two and two facts together. We know, looking ahead into the book of 2 Samuel, that after the Ark of the Covenant had been stored at Kiriath-Jearim for 20 years, David, in his 7th year as king, went and brought the Ark from Kiriath-Jearim in its 20th year to Jerusalem, and that was the 7th year that David reigned as king. He reigned from Jerusalem for 33 and a half years. But prior to that, David reigned in Hebron for 7 years. So here's the 40 years and 6 months that David reigned as king. 7 of those years overlapped back into the 20 years of Kiriath-Jearim where the ark was stored. Then we come back before that and we know that David became the king on the day that Saul died in the battle at Mount Gilboa. Okay, so with that, we can back up because we also know that Saul was king for 40 years. Back up. Okay, 40 years takes us back here. Well, that's interesting. In doing so, then we also know that the ark was stored for 13 years of Saul's reign because it's part of the 20 years. 13 and 7 make 20. So Saul was king when this ark was captured. And not only that, Saul was king 27 years before the ark was captured for this to lay out correctly. And what's interesting is, I've got it on the notes, but I don't have it here on the board. Saul was actually born back here before Eli had become the high priest. He was already a priest, but this was before Eli became the high priest. When he was just a priest, Saul was born. We also know something else that's interesting. David became the king in Israel when he was 30 years old. That means that David was born in the 10th year of the reign of Saul, 17 years before the ark was captured. Okay, you see this board, and I've also got these notes that are here that are online in my notes that I have for each one of these lessons. Now what I want us to do is I want us to review the facts that I've just said to you in a logical order so that you can see them here on the screen. Eli lived for 98 years and he died the day the ark was captured by the Philistines. When Eli died, he had served as high priest for 40 years. The ark was in the hands of the Philistines for 7 months. The ark was returned to Israel and placed in storage for 20 years. So in telling of the capture of the storage of the ark, Samuel did not mention the selection of Saul as king of Israel at all. Neither did he mention David moving the ark to Jerusalem in his 7th year as king. Those points were not part of the story in Samuel's mind. So far in the story, Samuel was presenting the capture of the ark and why it was in storage for 20 years. Now here in chapter 8, Samuel is tracing back over the timeline of Eli's ministry and the capture of the ark to focus on a new story about the selection of Saul as king. Once Samuel introduced and anointed Saul as king, he will tell his story in full that goes all the way through the rest of the book. Now in his story, David will be introduced, and at the end of this book, David will become king of Israel upon the death of King Saul, as I've already mentioned from the information here on the board. So the facts are these. David was 30 years of age when he became king. David was born in the 10th year of King Saul's reign, because king reigned for 40 years. So if David was 30 when he became king and Saul reigned for 40 years, it means that David was born in the 10th year of Saul's reign. It also, we know, that because David was 30 years when he began, that David was born 17 years before the capture of the ark. Why? Because Saul was king 27 years before the capture of the ark. 27 years before. So David is born right here. Boom. 27 minus 10 is 17 years. Okay. David was born while Eli was still the high priest. About the time of the return of the ark, when the Philistines have been ousted from Israel, when Samuel placed that rock and called it the Ebenezer rock at the location where the ark was captured, and where later, 7, 8 months later, the Philistines were defeated and thrown out of Israel, David will enter into Saul's life while these Philistines are now returning back and trying to secure a hold on Israel once again with their champion named Goliath. So that's the timing of all the stuff and how it fits. And so now we can return to Samuel's story here in chapter 8, verse number 8. And as a recap, the people had asked Samuel for a king, and the Lord had told Samuel that the people had not rejected Samuel, but the people had rejected him, the Lord, as their king. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." So in short, they did not trust that the Lord could keep the future judges in check after Samuel's death. They had rejected the Lord's instruction. The people wanted a worldly king to take the place of Samuel when he died. Now the Lord knew that he had been forsaken by the people, and we find that here as we pick up in verse number 8. "Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also." The feeling of the people for the Lord had not changed in all those years. They were unfaithful while Moses was in charge. They were unfaithful while Joshua was in charge. And for the past 400 years, they have been unfaithful while the Lord was in charge. Then the Lord says something interesting when he says here, "So they are doing to you also." The Lord is warning Samuel that the people will be unfaithful to him, to Samuel, in the future. And so the Lord gave Samuel this warning. And Samuel was to give a caution, or the caution of the Lord, back to the people concerning what's going to happen upon taking a king, an earthly king. He says this in verse 9. "Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." When the Lord says, "Now then, listen to their voice," he truly gives Samuel the authority to find a king because of their request. Listen to their voice. They're asking for it. Give him one. Give them one. However, the Lord wanted Samuel to caution all the people concerning how a king would change things in the promised land. First, a king will have the authority for the prescription of fighters, of warriors. Verse number 10. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots." For over 400 years, when an army was needed, the word simply went out to the tribes and volunteers would show up to fight. But with a king, the people would not have the opportunity to volunteer for the army. Service in the army would be mandatory. Number two, the prescription. A king would have the authority for the prescription of farmers. Get that, verse 12. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing, and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Not only will the king order the sons into the service of his army, but he will appoint them as farmers and in different offices. Then he will also take the sons to work in the king's fields and make the war instruments and equipment, and more about that we're going to get here in the next few verses. Third, the king will have the authority for the prescription of females, not just males, but women also. Verse number 13. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. Get ready for it, the Lord is saying to Israel. Get ready. Like in the other nations, the women and the girls will be taken from the work of the home and put into the work of the king. The hardship would cause the work of the home to go undone, but the work of the king would be done. Moving on with the prescriptions. Returning to that subject, the work of the field, and back to the work of the fields by the sons, the king would have the authority for the prescription of those fields, and he speaks first of the fruit of those fields in verse number 14. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. Notice that the king would take the fields and the service. It does not say that the king would buy them. He would take them. And what would be the king's take from the tribes? He would take their best. So continuing on, the king would take the seeds of the fields. Verse number 15. He will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. The king will not buy the 10th. He will take the 10th. He must understand, and we must understand, that without a king, the people had 90% of their crop for themselves to trade, to sell, to consume. But with a king, they would be reducing their take to 80%. Fifth, the king would have the authority for the prescription of the forces. Verse number 16. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. The cautions were bad enough so far, but now they are worse. The king will have the authority to take the employees and work animals of the farm away from their owners and use them for his own work and for his own farms. And the family's farm work will go undone. Sixth, the king will have the authority for the prescription of the flocks. Verse 17, he will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Before the king, every 10th animal went to the Lord, and the remaining 9 stayed with the owner. With the king, every 10th animal will go to the Lord. Every 9th animal, or every 10th animal, again, the 9th animal, will go to the king, and the owner will just have 8 for himself. This is a hardship. 7th, the king will have the authority of the prescription of the failure. Verse number 18. Then when you cry out in that day because your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. When you cannot bear the king any longer and what he desires, you're crying out to the Lord. That will do no good. The Lord will not answer you then because you rejected him as your king in your desires for a human king. 8th, the king will have the authority for the prescription of fantasy. Verse number 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Yeah, right. It was actually to be a fantasy among the people that the king would preside over them, to care for them. They would have a fantasy in their expectation about what the new guy in charge will be able to do in domestic issues and in war issues. We will see that it will not take long after they get their king that he will surely disappoint them. But then it will be too late to call upon the Lord for help, for they have rejected the Lord. And finally we come to the point in this chapter where Samuel tells of the command of the Lord, verse number 21. Now, after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and appoint them a king." So Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his city." So Samuel had heard the words of the Lord that we just read through. He repeated everything so the elders could not be mistaken about what was about to happen if a king was elected and selected. And then the Lord commanded Samuel to appoint a king. Do it, Samuel. You're going to appoint a king. So what did Samuel do with the elders? Samuel sent the elders to their homes. And he began the search for a king. Now, we must understand that God has his ways and man has his ways. God's ways are always higher than man's ways. Man's ways always bring hardship. God's ways always bring joy and blessings. But man seems to think that he has the ability to think better than God. God had set up the situation and the whole design for the nation of Israel perfectly. All they had to do was trust in him. He would fight, he would defend, he would take care of Israel. But the people didn't want to hear it. They wanted what they wanted, when they wanted. And I'm going to tell you this. In comes the new guy. He's about to come in. And he is going to be a disappointment. And in fact, For the next 40 years in the life of Israel, the first 40 years with Saul, we don't even know his name yet, but we're about to learn his name. The first 40 years with Saul as king, the nation of Israel is worse and in a worse situation than truly they've been in a long time. Under the time of Samuel, they were cared for. But now, under the time of the new king, disappointments are going to happen. He's going to tax them 10%. He's going to take 10% of everything they have. He's going to take their sons and their daughters and he's going to put them to jobs working for him. He's going to take their fields and do what he wants to do with them. He's not going to buy them. He's going to take them. He's going to do whatever he wants. Even though what he wants to do is not what the Lord wants him to do. But he is arrogant. And in fact, he becomes somewhat of a lunatic, as we will see. He will become crazy. But he was their king. They chose him as king. And because they chose him as king, they have to live with him as king. Well, with that said, in our next lesson, we will pick up with Samuel finding that king in a very strange way, a handsome man at age 30, and will appoint him as king.